After winning independence from England in the American Revolution, the United States government first operated under the Articles of Confederation. It didn't take long to realize that the Articles of Confederation provided for a central government that was too weak to be effective. I think it's helpful to categorize the various problems with the Articles into three main areas: economic, political, and diplomatic. First, what were some of the economic problems with the Articles of Confederation? The nation was facing war debt. Currency was nearly worthless with out-of-control inflation. And a nation can't pay off such a debt without raising revenue. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government did not have the power to collect taxes. They could request that the states send in tax money, but they couldn't enforce the tax collection. The central government also couldn't regulate interstate commerce. Trade was chaotic. Individual states had the power to place tariffs on each other, but the central government did not have that power. The economy was in serious depression, and you can look at the example of Shays' Rebellion to see some of the trouble that this situation was leading to. After Shays' Rebellion, it became more evident than ever that something had to be done, which would lead to the Constitutional Convention. But before we go there, let's think about some of the political problems under the Articles of Confederation. Under this form of government, there was only one branch in the government, the legislative branch, a simple legislature where each state had an equal vote. There was also a unanimous requirement. In order to amend the Articles of Confederation, each state had to agree, which made it difficult to carry out much change. This also led to diplomatic problems because, as you might imagine, a nation that was too weak to get its act together economically or politically had trouble getting other nations to take it seriously. Okay, one example was with England. After the American Revolution, England still had some troops in America. We were anxious to see those troops removed, but how are we supposed to negotiate? They won't take us seriously. We look too weak. Spain is another example. The United States wanted to secure the right to navigate the Mississippi River, use the port of New Orleans, but until we showed that we were able to stand on our own 2 feet, we weren't able to get foreign nations like Spain to take us seriously. So very soon, most leaders agreed that something had to be done. The Articles of Confederation were too weak. But where they disagreed was how exactly to correct those problems. I want you to picture a pendulum. A pendulum that swings back and forth like on a grandfather clock from one extreme to the other. To many Americans of this time, a pendulum could swing either to tyranny or anarchy. Think about that for a second. These two extremes, both of them were considered undesirable. No one wanted tyranny. That's what they had just fought against when they declared independence from England. But on the other hand, too much liberty could result in anarchy, and they wanted order. So picture this pendulum swinging between tyranny and anarchy, between order and liberty. Most Americans agreed that they wanted to establish the proper balance between the two. But how exactly to go about that? There's where the difference became apparent. When the Constitutional Convention was called in 1787, originally Congress only gave the authority to revise the Articles of Confederation. What actually happened was that the Articles were set aside and completely replaced. This was basically a peaceful overthrow of the government. This convention met in secrecy throughout the summer, And the idea was to come up with a federal plan that blended nationalism and state power. It wouldn't be a complete dissolution of the states, and at the same time everyone agreed that the states could not keep all the power to themselves. So under the federal system there would be states within a nation sharing various powers. A lot of compromise was called for in working out the new Constitution. First, I want you to be aware of the Great Compromise. When James Madison showed up in Philadelphia, he had a plan, the Virginia Plan, basically a blueprint for the Constitution that would be hammered out later. In this Virginia Plan, Madison called for 3 branches of government, not just one, but a legislative body, an executive branch, and also a judicial branch. These 3 branches would divide powers and provide a system of checks and balances against each other. Another part of the Virginia Plan was that the legislature would be based on popular representation. This meant that larger states with greater populations would send more representatives to Congress. States like Virginia that had large populations liked this idea just fine, but as you might imagine, smaller states like New Jersey were not happy with this idea. They were used to a one state, one vote arrangement, and they knew that smaller states like New Jersey would lose a proportion of influence under such a plan. The New Jersey plan was that each state would have an equal vote, like before. Obviously, this would have to be settled in compromise. You couldn't have it both ways. With the Great Compromise, the legislative branch would be divided into 2 different houses, the upper house, or the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives. The upper house, the Senate, would be based on the New Jersey plan. In the Senate, each state has equal representation, 2 senators. But in the lower house, the House of Representatives, a state's representatives are based on the size of the state's population. You should also be aware of the 3/5 compromise. The southern states wanted to be able to count slaves in determining their population. Why? Because this would lead to greater representation in Congress. Of course, the northern states, which had abolished slavery one by one, saw this as an unfair advantage to the slaveholding states, that they shouldn't be able to count their slaves. After all, those slaves weren't voters. This was resolved with the 3/5 compromise, where southern states would be able to count 3/5 of the slave population. Not all of them, but some of them, for purposes of representation. However, another part of the compromise was that 3/5 of the slave population would also be counted for taxation purposes. They could use them for greater representation, but they would also have to pay tax on what they regarded as human property. The new Constitution, in many ways, fixed the problems with the Articles of Confederation. As we've already seen, there would be 3 branches of government, checks and balances. And when it came to economic problems, such as the power to tax and regulate commerce, these problems were also addressed in the new Constitution. But once all the compromises were worked out, the job still wasn't finished. Even after the new Constitution had been completed, it still had to be ratified by a majority of the states before it would go into effect. In these state conventions, there was much debate over whether or not the Constitution should be adopted. Again, there's this concern over the pendulum. Many feared that it would swing too far towards order, or that it would swing too far towards liberty. No one wanted tyranny or anarchy. This helps understand the Anti-Federalists. Why were people like Patrick Henry so suspicious of the new Constitution? They feared that it would create a central government that, instead of being too weak, would be too strong, and that it might take away from the rights of the states and the rights of individuals. Anti-Federalists were concerned with individual liberties. Many of these concerns were addressed in the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The Federalist Papers were a series of essays that addressed all of these criticisms and tried to reassure Americans that the Constitution was not something to be feared, that it was beneficial and necessary. Federalists argued that this new government would have only the powers that were specifically mentioned in the Constitution. If the Constitution didn't give the government the power to do something, we were to assume that that power did not exist and that it was left to the states and individuals. As it turned out, by 1789, enough states had ratified the Constitution that it went into effect without a Bill of Rights. However, James Madison continued to push for a Bill of Rights to win more support among Anti-Federalists. He wanted to build a stronger consensus. He didn't want to see former opponents of the Constitution forced to abide by it with resentment. He wanted to win over their support even after the Constitution had gone through. He thought that the Bill of Rights would help make this possible. And in these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, individual liberties are specifically guaranteed. There's a promise that the government will never take away those liberties. For example, free speech, freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms. You can look over these amendments and see many of the individual liberties that Americans during this period valued very highly and wanted guarantees that they would not be taken away. Once this new government was established, it was much easier to choose a president than it had been to work out compromises over the powers of the presidency. Everyone agreed that George Washington was the man for the job. And unlike modern campaigns where candidates actively seek voter support, Washington basically accepted the call to serve his country. I want to look at the Washington administration in terms of domestic issues and foreign issues. What was going on within the nation during his presidency and what was going on outside of the nation as well. When it came to domestic affairs, one important thing was to set precedents early on, to establish a pattern for those who would follow him. He had to establish leadership and authority that would be respected. An example of this is with the Whiskey Rebellion, when Washington showed a willingness to use troops to put down a rebellion against the whiskey tax. He also had to deal with the problem of Indian warfare. But the single most important domestic issue of the early republic was the debate over Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. Hamilton was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and he had a 3-part plan that he presented to Congress that showed his vision for the American economy. First of all, Hamilton had a report on public credit, where he advocated funding and assumption. Let me take some time to explain how this worked. Hamilton believed it was very important that the new national government honor its debts, that it repay all loans from the American Revolution. Some states had more success than others in doing this. Some states had begun paying off their individual debts, some of them to soldiers in the Revolution and creditors within the United States and abroad. Other states hadn't made much headway at all. Hamilton believed that the new federal government should assume all of the state debts, or take them on, lump them all into one pile, and pay them off together as a nation. It makes sense that the nation would need to honor its debts in order to establish respect and trust. And it also makes sense that if the federal government were to do this as a nation, that there would be more loyalty towards the new federal government. The government that makes it possible for you to be repaid is going to establish more credibility with you. However, this plan was controversial. In the years after the Revolution, when the economy was in such a mess, many of the original holders of certificates who were entitled to repayment feared that these pieces of paper were worthless. The government owed them money, and they were afraid that they would never be repaid. And so very often they ended up selling these certificates to speculators for pennies on the dollar, just a fraction of what they were supposed to be worth. But as you might imagine, if you were a poor veteran farmer whose family needed food, and someone offered you pennies on the dollar for something you thought might never be worth any more than that, you would consider taking them up on it. So many speculators, particularly from New England, were taking this chance on the federal government eventually getting its act together and honoring those debts. So parts of the country where there's a large proportion of poorer people who seem to be getting the short end of the stick tended to be against Hamilton's policy. Hamilton also called for a national bank, the Bank of the United States. This too was controversial. Many Americans, especially in the South and the West, feared that a national bank would benefit a privileged few at the expense of other Americans. They thought that it too much resembled the bank in England and was inviting corruption. Like Hamilton's plan for public credit, the Bank of the United States was passed. It did go through Congress after a compromise over relocating the nation's capital closer to the South in Washington, D.C., which was just a swamp at the time. But the third part of Hamilton's plan, his report on manufactures, was not adopted by Congress at the time. Hamilton thought that the federal government should promote the growth of manufacturing, that the nation had relied too heavily on agriculture. Remember, during colonial times, the American colonies specialized in producing the raw materials that were then shipped to England for manufacturing. Hamilton thought that the government should promote the growth of manufacturing to have a better balance in the economy. Again, he faced opposition. Some people believed that it would be bad for America to see the growth of cities and manufacturing. Thomas Jefferson, for example, believed that only a rural America could produce the virtue and independence necessary to a strong republic. He wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God." And he went on to talk about the virtues of agricultural life. And then he wrote, "The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body." Okay? Comparing cities to sores. Hamilton, of course, didn't see it that way. He instead focused on job opportunities. Finally, let's consider foreign affairs in the early republic. This was the time of the French Revolution, which at first some Americans greeted as good news that France was following America's example, declaring independence and throwing off tyranny. But many Americans, and more all the time, came to view the French Revolution as a disorderly example of anarchy. It became very bloody. They were chopping off the heads of monarchs, clearly not following the example of the American Revolution to the letter. The French Revolution also led to war between France and England once again, as France began attempting to spread its revolution across Europe. England stood up to resist it. What this meant for America was that we were caught in the middle of the conflict. Both France and England wanted us to side with them against the other. France claimed that we owed them the help that they had given us in winning the American Revolution. The United States tried to remain neutral. We were just getting our own act together, and it seemed in our best interest to stay out of this European conflict. But that would prove to be difficult when both England and France began attacking our ships. We'll revisit this situation later and see how we'll eventually be dragged into the war. The domestic and foreign issues of the time should help you understand the development of the first two-party system. When the nation first began, many, like George Washington, hoped that there would never be political parties in America. They viewed parties as a bad thing, like factions, self-interested people bickering over their different interests. But very soon it became apparent that parties would develop. The first party system was made up of the Federalists and the Republicans. First, I want to give you a representative of each party that in many ways symbolizes what the party stood for. When you think of the Federalists, think of Alexander Hamilton. When you think of the Republicans, sometimes called the Jeffersonian Republicans, think of Thomas Jefferson. There were two main issues that divided these parties. First of all, when it came to foreign policy, they were divided over the conflict between France and England. Republicans were more likely to favor siding with France if they were forced to choose sides, and Federalists like Hamilton leaned more towards England. Even though we had just won a war for independence from England, in many ways they believed we still had more in common with England than any other nation in the world, certainly more so than France. And then there was also the domestic issue of financial policy. These parties disagreed over Hamilton's financial vision for the United States. Federalists like Hamilton obviously favoring Hamilton's plan, and Jeffersonian Republicans like Jefferson being critical of that plan and having a more agrarian vision for the economy of the nation. The differences between these parties weren't just about having competing visions of the future, but there were also different interpretations of the Constitution. Hamilton was what you could call a loose constructionist. Jefferson you could call a strict constructionist. They read the Constitution differently. When it came to the Bank of the United States, which was a good example of this, the Constitution didn't say anything about a national bank. Okay, so what does that mean? According to Hamilton, it doesn't have to specifically mention a national bank in the Constitution for it to be constitutional. The Constitution does not say the federal government cannot establish a national bank. Therefore, with his